I am interviewing Grandpa Richard Goodkin about how his ancestors immigrated from Belarus.
Do you have any questions for me?
Oh yeah, right. First question. What year did your ancestors come from Russia?
My father's father,
Mm-hmm.
David Goodkin, came over to the United States around 1914, and a few years later, after he saved up enough money, he sent for his wife, Fanny, and my father, Harry. They came over in 1918.
Okay. Now, which members of your family immigrated to America?
The three that I just mentioned, my grandfather, David, and then my grandmother, Fanny, then my father, Harry.
Okay. What countries did they come from?
They came from Belarus.
Okay. Now, why did people in your family immigrate to America?
Well, it was very poor in Europe, and it was hard for a lot of people, but it was especially hard for Jewish people, which they were, because there was a lot of discrimination, and there were laws that didn't permit them to own property or practice certain kinds of trades, and there were actually violent campaigns against them called pogroms. So they were very glad to get away from that and come to America.
Okay. Yes. Why did? Wait, I already read that. Sorry. What languages did your ancestors speak?
They spoke the native language of Belarus. Most people in Belarus also spoke Russian, and because they had Jewish culture, they also spoke Yiddish, which was a combination of Hebrew and German.
Okay. Next one. How did your ancestors travel to America?
I don't know how my grandfather David came. He probably took a train across Europe and would have caught an ocean liner from Europe to Massachusetts to Boston, which was a port of immigration at that time. And I'm sure that he traveled very economically, which probably would have been third class or steerage, way down in the bottom of the ship. When he had saved up enough money, he sent for my grandmother Fanny and my father Harry, who was only about 5 years old at the time. But because World War I was raging in Europe, and there were battles and violence and armies moving, they couldn't come across Europe. So they had to travel west, across Siberia, through China, and through Japan. In Japan, they would have caught a ship that took them all the way across the Pacific to the west coast of America, which was California. Then they would have traveled cross country by train to Massachusetts to meet up with my grandfather David.
Okay. Now, what was the travel like?
I have no stories from my grandfather what his trip was like, but it was probably okay because he had the money to buy tickets and things were calm then. The continent was not at war. So it was probably, maybe 3-4 weeks by train and ship to get to America. But because of World War I, which was going from 1914 to 1918, and my father and his mother traveled in 1918, things were very difficult. They had to travel across the immense continent of Asia. They traveled through China and through Japan. My father told us that he had memories in Japan of seeing a thief being punished by having his hand stuck in a pot of boiling water. Also, my father was young, and his recollection is that he contracted every childhood disease along the way, from chicken pox to measles to whatever. So they were quarantined for a number of times, and he had to stay in places to recuperate. And he told me that the trip took them 6 months to go from Belarus all the way across Asia and the Pacific and the U.S. until they finally were reunited with my grandfather in Massachusetts.
Okay, did some people get sick or die during the travel?
Well, no one died. But as I just mentioned, my father.
I know. Yeah, you're.
My father had a lot of childhood illnesses, which made the trip take forever.
Now here's question number. Okay, so but here's the 10th one. What was the trip uncomfortable? Was the trip uncomfortable?
Well, my grandfather who had come to America before them had to save up money to send for his wife and son, his son, my father Harry, and back then people would travel. They were poor people; they weren't wealthy people, so they would travel in third-class railway carriages, and they would travel on the ship in steerage, which was third class. So it certainly was anything but vacation or luxury travel. And as I just mentioned, my father had all these illnesses, so it was a pretty difficult and uncomfortable trip for them, but they made it.
Okay. Now, what part of America did they arrive at?
They arrived in Massachusetts and settled there, and that's the reason that we're all here in Massachusetts right now.
Well, yeah, it says that you arrived in Boston.
That's right.
Okay. What jobs did they have when they came to America? Were they successful?
I don't know or remember what my grandfather David did when he came here, but after he was reunited with his family, which was just his wife and my father, he and his wife had 3 more children, so that my father had 1 brother and 2 sisters. Then, unfortunately, my grandfather David died very young at age 35, and I think it was from kidney disease, at least the story I was told. So that left my grandmother with 4 young children, and she spoke very little English and had no special skills. And I have no idea how they made it and all survived, but they did. And everyone had to work all the time. They had to be very careful with money. My grandmother eventually remarried, so she married someone who made a living, so that must have helped a lot. And my father and his 3 siblings made a very good life in America. They all married and had families. They were all reasonably successful economically. They all had children. And the children included 8 grandchildren. 3 of them became doctors, and coincidentally, they all became neurologists. I became a lawyer, and everyone did very well here in America.
Yeah. Okay. Now the last question: did you ever actually meet these ancestors, and did they describe to you what it was like living in their country and what the culture and traditions are like in Goma, Belarus?
Well, my only surviving grandparent was my grandmother, my father's mother, Fanny, and she died when I was fairly young, and she spoke very little of life in the old country. That's what they called it, the old country, because America was the new country, the new world. And my father spoke a little bit about childhood memories that he had of being in Belarus. He said that he recalls Cossacks riding through the village on horseback with their long black boots, but really very little else of anything that happened over in Belarus. Any more questions?
Like I said, that is all the questions.
Well, thank you very much.
And we're done.